Hey guys, Parfact here, and today is another tier list video. All right, let's get started. So today we're going to be doing a tier list on the best PVE weapons, or at least the weapons you will see most next patch. Now, we're going to have a couple in the S tier, and these are just going to be, well, the weapons that are just always going to be in the dungeon. There's going to be a few weird exceptions here where I'm going to put them probably lower, or for sure lower than they're actually supposed to be, but that's mainly because people just don't know how good the weapon is. So let's not wait too long and let's get into it. We're going to go ahead. We're actually going to start here at the life staff. S tier, you need a healer. Pretty self-explanatory. I mean, what else are we going to say? You can go in without a healer, but you're probably going to die. So S tier life staff. Next, we have Blunder. Now, if you guys didn't know, Bane got buffed. So on ranged weapons, it's going to give about a 10% damage increase from last patch. Blunder did recently get a nerf to its Azov Shrapnel Blast. So we're going to put this down here in the C category. Now, we're putting it down here because I just don't think you're going to see it that often. We're probably going to have a build that has it in it, and hopefully this moves up the tier list a little bit. When it comes to consistent damage, it is just not there comparatively to all the other weapons. And part of this problem is when you scale it, if you're really trying to scale the Blunderbuss, it doesn't have any other weapon that it actually scales with. So you have to scale its secondary attribute or its first attribute. So you either got to go a weapon with strength or a weapon with intelligence. And it just means that the weapon doesn't scale that hard because of it. So we're putting down here in the C category, but it's still not a horrible weapon, but definitely not going to top any charts on, basically not going to do anything for you in the PvE scene. So yeah. Next, we're going to have bow. We're going to put it here in the B category. Everybody talks about the bow getting a buff because we get the range damage. Well, the bow actually gets a PvE nerf this patch. The bow lost 15% of its damage, but it's only gaining 10% of Bane. So you're going to see it, and the only reason why we have it here in the B category is because you see it inside the corrupted dungeons, and there are more corrupted dungeons than anything. So you'll see it there, but that's it. Now, we are going to be squishier next patch, which if I'd probably had to put the bow somewhere right now, I'd probably put it on the C category. But the meta is going to get shaken up at least a little bit here with the PvE side. People are going to be squishier, so you are going to actually have a benefit to having range in your group now. So we're putting it here in the B category, but don't expect it to see it very often, and you still don't want it if you're running anything other than corrupted. Next, Ice Gauntlet, easily the worst DPS weapon on here. You do not want to see it in any circumstances, even if you want to make the argument to run something like Ice Storm, Ice Pylon, Ice Spike, which it's only 3 damaging abilities. There's actually a weapon on this list that is just straight up better than it. The Blunderbuss is better than it, even in that category. So you don't really want to see it. You don't want to really see it at all. It has a little bit of crowd controlling with Shower, but you don't really need it. Just a weapon that really doesn't bring anything to the table. And I know a lot of the people with this next weapon, Fire Staff, got a nice buff, and everybody probably wants to pair it with the Ice Gauntlet, but that's just not the thing you want to do because Ice Gauntlet, just in general, honestly, is just really bad. It's the worst PvE weapon in the game. Well, maybe other than, there's one other weapon we'll probably see down here in the D tier, just, foreshadowing, but yeah, D tier. Next, let's actually put the Fire Staff. We're going to put it last because that's the biggest one here. Next, Greataxe. We're going to put it here in the A. It doesn't do a whole lot of damage. It got its damage nerfed, but any speed run or any group that has a, correct group comp will always need a Greataxe. You can argue this should be S tier, but it doesn't do very much damage, which is the reason why we're not putting it up in S. But you absolutely do need it for Gravity Well Maelstrom to group enemies super tight. The super good weapon, and any proper comp is going to have one. What else is there to say? You don't ever want to main it as DPS, but it's still just a really good weapon, and you have to have it. Greatsword, easily going to be the highest damaging weapon next patch for New World. It did receive a few little nerfs, but it also received a buff in the 300 strength passive. So the Greatsword is going to be great. The grit change really doesn't affect it because it's got grit on its heavy attacks anyway, which is the only thing that you really need to do to actually do proper DPS with the Greatsword. Now, it is going to be something to be said when people go this, they're going to be squishier, and then next patch you're going to be squishier. So builds are going to have to adjust in some form to actually make it to where they actually survive next patch, because Greatswords are pretty prevalent in the PvE scene. But the Hatchet right now is used over them because the Hatchet's a little bit safer. It's not as much damage, but you can play a little bit safer with the Hatchet. But the Hatchet got really nerfed. So it's going to be interesting to see people go to the Greatsword and how many people die because of the Greatsword because of all the fortified change nerfs. So it's going to be interesting to see. But the Greatsword is definitely going to be the highest single target damaging weapon in the game next patch. And there's nothing really that close to it. Warhammer, the Warhammer got a lot of nerfs, but it is still the best offhand weapon for tanking. That isn't going to change, or that hasn't changed. There's a few other options coming next patch. We're going to put it in the B category. Now, most tanks should be running Warhammer. Now, you might be asking yourself, Parfex, but Hatchet, blah, 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 blah. Well, the thing about Warhammer is if you're tanking properly, you want to put up as much of the utility as possible, and the Warhammer does that for you. It has crowd control for the big pools. It has two different rends. It has Armor Breaker and Shockwave that allows you to run the targets to make sure your DPS doesn't have to do it. Now, before you go, Parfex, the DPS should do something. If you're in a proper group, the DPS should only worry about essentially DPSing, and then the healer and the tank should worry about everything else. That way you can get through the dungeon as fast as possible and as smooth as possible. But still going to be a weapon you are going to see, but it is not a DPS weapon. Do not use it in LAS. This weapon is very bad for DPS, but for your tanks, you're still going to see it. Next, we have the Hatchet. The Hatchet has been S tier for an incredible period of time. Let's talk a little bit about what the Hatchet received this patch. So it had a few of its passives change, so now it wants to add in heavy attacks to its rotation, which is going to be a little bit I mean, it's gonna make you lose damage. There's no other way to say it. It got the fortify change hits the Hatchet kind of hard because the Hatchet has a few pieces of fortify. Berserk now is lifesteal instead of actually healing you. Berserk, which doesn't really affect the PvE side of it, it's gonna make you go back. It's gonna basically bump you up 3,500 health. And then one of your best passives, which is when the mob or any enemy gets under 30% health, that you get it's like a 20% in damage. But that passive now is only going to work on heavy attacks and abilities, which is a massive damage decrease. The Hatchet received a bunch of nerfs across the board. And also, actually, the biggest nerf is actually the Raging Torrent is now going to only proc once every quarter second. So with all these changes, the Hatchet definitely goes down. They're going to be squishier. They're going to deal less damage. The rotation is going to change. We're going to put it in the A tier. The Hatchet is no longer the weapon that you have to see in a dungeon to make the run go smooth. The Hatchet lost a lot of its damage. It lost a little bit of its defensive with the fortify. Fortify nerfed across the board, but the extra fortify was still always good. But honestly, the Hatchet should probably be farther down the list, but everybody has Hatchet builds, so you're still going to see them next patch. But it's going to be a pretty stark change next patch, and the Hatchet received probably the biggest set of nerfs out of all the weapons. Musket, easily S tier. I'm just kidding, D tier. You knew this was coming down here. Musket's horrible. The Musket, I guess, is better than the Ice Gauntlet in single target damage. The Ice Gauntlet can just put down 2 abilities and swap weapons. Yeah, just don't use a Musket. Maybe one day they'll make Musket viable in PvE, but until then, yeah, it's real bad. Next, we have Rapier. Rapier is a weapon that should see more play. There's a couple different things about the Rapier that really help out the group that people don't really know about. Maybe I'll put a video out about that here in the future. But the Rapier is still an extremely squishy playstyle. It does, again, provide itself to sort of the same thing as Blunder, where it scales 2 different attributes, and those attributes really don't really scale with anything. But the one thing that it has going for it is because it is a melee, and I guess the Blunder could technically do this anyway, but you can just run a Void Gauntlet on your back bar. Rapier is going to be, man, it's hard for me to put it in B category because it's definitely an A category. We're going to put it in the A category, and this is mainly just because the absolutely cracked out damage the Rapier does. People don't actually know how much the Rapier does in damage, and that's mainly because the DPS tests that have been done don't really ever test the Rapier. I actually have a video that I tested the Rapier damage, but the problem with testing the Rapier damage is it is so incredibly hard to get an actual correct DPS test on it, so it's pretty crazy. Now, there are a few people that think the Rapier do more damage than it actually does because they just can't calculate it in their head. They're just like, I have no idea how to calculate this, so it must do crazy damage. But it definitely is up there when it comes to the damage category. Any absolutely min-max speed run is going to have one Rapier Void Gauntlet in their group, at least as of right now. Next patch, that could change, but it's definitely a very good weapon. Spear we're going to put up here in the S category. Now, when it comes to straight DPS, the Spear lacks. The Spear does less damage than the Rapier, the Hatchet, the Greatsword, the Bow. No, it still does more damage than the Bow, but it definitely does less damage than these three weapons right here, but it has a lot of utility. This is going to be used a lot with something like the Greatsword. It's going to give you that big cracked out single target damage. It's going to give you the utility of having the perforate. Now, perforate did get nerfed, at least it's fortify, so you're basically not going to be tanky at all when you hit fortify now. But we have weaken on skewer, and we have weaken on perforate with rend. Then you also have a knockdown or a stun if you want it. So the Spear does a lot of nice abilities that you're really going to need. It's got the perforate and the skewer that's just every dungeon can really utilize very well. So the Spear, you're going to see a ton of next patch, and it's not the craziest on DPS, but it has really great utility that everybody needs. Sword and Shield, obviously it is the best tanking weapon by a long shot, and it's actually not horrible at damage. A lot of people don't know that. Now, there's some misconceptions out there that it is the second highest single target damaging weapon, which is just not true. And if you guys really want me to make a video about why, I can. But we're going to put it in S tier just because if you're going to tank, there's no better weapon to tank with than the sword, especially next patch. There was some argument to be made that you want to maybe do Greatsword, but next patch, you're really going to need a sword. The sword even bumps up its stock in the tanking world because of the DPS or the fortified changes, stuff like that. And the sword has some nice ways around getting through some of that defensives. It has some extra defenses built in. So sword, definitely its stonks are up, and it is going to be an S tier weapon next patch. All right, we're at Void Gauntlet. Void Gauntlet's going solidly in the A category. You are always going to want this in your group. This is very similar to the Greataxe. You actually probably want two of these in your group. Your life staff user should be running Void Gauntlet, and one of your DPS should be running Void Gauntlet. This is going to give you a ton of buffs. Now, Oblivion did get nerfed. Tanks are not just going to be able to sit in Oblivion and hit block and get their stamina back. The stamina is now to stamina regen instead of flat stamina back. It is a massive nerf for PvP and PvE, depending on how you use it. But Oblivion still does give you that empower that you are looking for. It gives, I believe, weaken. It is just an overall fantastic weapon that having an Oblivion down 24/7 does nothing but great things for your group. So Void Gauntlet, definitely A tier. Last, but certainly not least, is the Fire Staff. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Fire Staff, where it ranks in DPS. So, I can tell you right now that it is not far behind the Rapier in DPS. Before you absolutely crucify me like you did in one of my videos, I have the test to prove it. Now, I may have had them all written down, spent hours on it, and then deleted it. So that video is going to come out. Trust me, but it's going to take some time for me to fit it back into my schedule to get it down. But the Fire Staff isn't very far behind the Rapier when it comes to single target damage. Where the Fire Staff shines is in two other categories. One, AoE. The Fire Staff next patch is going to be absolutely cracked in AoE damage. It also has Pillar of Fire, which I didn't calculate. It's cooldown into my damage chest, which is going to be absolutely cracked next patch. This weapon is going to blow up clumps. It also is an int weapon that scales very well with Void, so you're going to probably want to run Void with it. There's another weapon or two you can run in the back bar. But it also has Flamethrower to kind of get around the range. Now, I know people hate Flamethrower. Flamethrower really didn't see... Well, actually, technically it's all nerf, but really didn't see a nerf. But the thing about Flamethrower is when it comes to Phalanx, you can actually get around the Phalanx tag with Flamethrower. So you have basically no downsides. You also can play at range if needed to be extra safe. You have that middle... like melee playstyle, but just far enough back to not get hit by a lot of the basic attacks. The Fire Staff, in my opinion, next patch is going to be the best of the high DPS weapons, but also the safest. It's not going to do the most damage. Greatsword has that covered. You're not going to beat Greatsword. It's not going to have the most utility. There's weapons like Spear and Greataxe that are going to take that. But it is going to be an extremely safe weapon to play, and an extremely high damaging AoE burst. You can argue that the Fire Staff, especially after the Hatchet nerfs, is going to be the highest AoE damage there is. And let's be honest, most of the bosses, you don't really struggle on damage. It's just kind of survivability that we really struggle with. So I personally would probably put it in the S tier because you're probably going to see it. We'll put it in the A tier just because these weapons, you basically, like, this is the highest damaging weapon. This, of course, is the Life Staff. This is, of course, the best, like, weakened weapon in the game that you're always going to have, and it also applies Rens, and this is your best tanking weapon. And then down here, we basically have our big high damaging weapons. Our Void Gauntlet gives us some utility, and then our Greataxe. That's kind of where we're putting the Fire Staff. It doesn't do as much damage as the Greatsword. It doesn't have as much utility as the Spear, Sword, or Life Staff, but it is going to be extremely prevalent next patch, and you're going to want to see a Fire Staff in your group. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. Like always, like I said, this isn't necessarily a tier list of what is the absolute best DPS, because that is something that is extremely hard to actually calculate. We have been working on a video for that, but even calculating it without an actual test, I mean, there's some factors that don't go into, it's hard to actually test it. Like, even the tests that have been out there, I don't want to say they're not correct. It's hard to actually test it because they've done a lot of great work on testing them, but it's actually extremely difficult in New World to factor it in because you got to factor in, you know, are we getting back hits? You know, we have dot rotations on the Rapier. The Rapier has a very odd rotation that doesn't actually go, that's not like some of the weapons where it's like every second they basic attack. Fire Staff's super easy to actually calculate its damage. Everything basically goes off of 1 second increments. The Rapier doesn't, so it's a lot harder. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Like, comment, subscribe. Like always, let me know what you think about this in the comment section down below, and I'll see you next time. Peace.